Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Hamre, and welcome. I'm the president at CSIS, but this is a rare opportunity for me. I don't normally have a chance to lead programs, but because Joe Nye is one of my bosses, I took the privilege of asking to be the moderator of this conversation this afternoon with Joe, and we're going to talk about his latest book. I'm holding it up so all of you who are joining us virtually can know about it. It's called A Life in the American Century by Joe Nye, and it's a wonderful read. It's a gentle read. It's like walking along with a very long-standing friend through a park, and you're having these conversations, and then all of a sudden you see just this nugget on the sidewalk, and you want to pick it up. And what I'm going to do this afternoon is to pick up some of these nuggets, and we'll explore it a little bit and ask Joe to reflect on it. I'm going to be using his book. I finished it just last night, but so glad I had a chance to do that. And Joe, let me start with one of the most interesting early observations in the book, and you were quoting Robert Putnam, who you said was the head of the American Political Science Association, a fellow colleague at Harvard, and he was talking about the 1960s and the way in which the 1960s reflected kind of an inversion of American sentiments about ourselves. And I'll just read how you quoted it here. You said, and this is quoting Putnam, the 1960s was rather like a swimmer making a flip turn. Americans entered the 1960s moving toward community, but midway through the decade abruptly changed direction and left the 1960s behind, moving towards individualism. And, I think that's really quite right. And I've seen it in my own little way. But can you expand on it? What did that mean from a standpoint of foreign policy?
Well, it was something of a schizophrenic decade. In the beginning of the decade, there was respect for authority. By the end of the decade, you had buildings being ransacked. I had a bomb go off in my office at Harvard. So that's quite a contrast between the two parts of the decade. There are a lot of people who ask what could cause this, and the immediate causes were the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. But some people think there were deeper causes as a new generation of post-war babies reached maturity and pushed through the institutions. That created pressure, and you had riots in France and Japan, not just in the United States. But Vietnam was a triggering, immediate triggering. I mean, the mistrust which developed as a result of Vietnam, I think, was like putting the match to the oil.
You talk about that. I mean, when you open your chapter 2, which is the Vietnam years, and you say that in the early 1960s, 3/4 of Americans told pollsters that they had a great deal of confidence in government. In the 1970s, after Vietnam and Watergate, that number had declined to 1/4, and it never recovered to the earlier levels. It feels like it's getting worse now.
Well, the polls show that trust in government goes up and down, but when you look historically, the big drop was the early 70s, and it was a combination of Watergate as well as Vietnam that you see this huge drop in the polls. After that, it bounces around, goes up a little bit in the Reagan years, goes back down again, goes up again in the Clinton years. It's down again now to lows that are like the Watergate, post-Watergate period. But looking back historically, the cliff that we fell over was about 72 or 74.
Joe, it feels that now it has an institutional structure to it, the way that the Congress has become so divided. I mean, back in 70s, there were still conservative Democrats and there were some moderate Republicans. Feels like that we now have a structural division that's making this worse. How do you look at that?
Well, there's severe polarization today. I point out in the book that polarization is not new in American society or politics. Growing up in a rural area in a town of 500 people, I knew no Democrats at all. Everybody was Republican. And when Franklin Roosevelt died, my children of my age said, "Oh, the tyrant is dead," which was obviously their parents' attitudes. That's a pretty severe polarization. But I think the polarization that we have today is a little bit broader and deeper than that. And I think it is a real problem, even though we've had it before.
You've not been in government in the last, say, 10 years, but you talk to people all the time. Just today, I know that you had extensive consultation. It's harder now to be in government when we have such polarization, especially in the Congress. What would be your counsel to a generic member of administration to how to find a way to work with everybody these days?
Well, there are various proposals for bipartisanship. When we started the Aspen Strategy Group that I started with Brent Scowcroft and Bill Perry in the 80s, the idea was to reach out on a bipartisan basis to think about a strategy for the United States. That's a type of device, but I think you really have to go deeper than that. What we have now is in our electoral system so much gerrymandering that the partisan people of various parties, both Democrats and Republicans, are worried more about the primary than the general election. And that means that essentially the extremes get rewarded. So we've had various congressmen, congresspeople come to the Kennedy School before they enter, and they always, when they're there, talk about how they're going to reach across the aisle and work together. And they get to Washington and they find that the rewards for those who take the more extreme positions. And if you could have something where you had more impartial drawing of districts, congressional districts, or where you had something like the open primaries that California's experimenting with, we need to do something to get away from primaries. It's interesting. I mean, Donald Trump was able to use the threat of a primary opponent to essentially gain control of the whole Republican Party. So he was able to squeeze the middle of the Republican distribution of views to the extreme, because anybody who didn't fit that pattern, he was threatened with a primary.
Yeah, he turned on them. Yeah. Joe, we'll come back to that. And you've spent so much of your career at Harvard, and you were writing about this. Now, you're writing about in the 1970s, early 1970s, and at one point you say, "I believe that the university is a place for analysis of ideas on their own merits, a free marketplace of ideas, one of the few in society, and thus academics should rarely try to act as a pressure group." We're awful lot of criticism these days of, are universities really a place of genuine open dialogue and conversation? Do you care to reflect on that? You've had, especially at Harvard, you've had some
I think
episodes.
The danger is when universities succumb to the pressure to take a position on public issues that have nothing to do with universities. Why should universities have a position on the Vietnam War or on the war in Gaza and so forth? Individual professors should, student groups should, but the university as a whole necessarily should not. And yet the pressures from external politics meaning big donors and various student groups, are that the university has to take a position. It's hard for a university administrator not to succumb to that, but that just reinforces the divisions inside the university, because not everybody agrees with the position that the administration takes. So in principle, one would like to see presidents of universities resist that and to restrain themselves from public positions to issues that touch the university, like freedom of speech or various efforts to control the university. But that horse may be out of the barn.
Well, it's interesting because there's now a real campaign here in Washington about wokeism, in universities, and the feeling that ESG is an agenda of the left and it's captured universities, and it's becoming a political force. What do universities do about that?
Well, I think there is something in the criticism in the sense that if you create offices to enforce diversity, once you create a bureaucracy, the bureaucrats are going to want to find rules. The rules are going to be too rigid, and it can get somewhat out of control. So I think it's important to have diversity and inclusion, but I'm a little bit skeptical of the bureaucratization of it. I think the universities could ease back somewhat on the bureaucratization of diversity and inclusion, but not the principles, which we definitely want to pursue. I think that I think there's a pendulum swinging here. I think it may wind up swinging back a little bit, but I do worry a lot about external forces such as billionaires threatening to withdraw funds, trying to micromanage the university.
When the war in Gaza broke out, it was astounding. I think there was something like 34 student organizations at Harvard that came together on a joint letter of protest. How serious is anti-Semitism at Harvard?
I don't see anti-Semitism. Of the various decisions that I've been involved in, hiring people over the last 50 years, I've never once heard somebody to ask whether the candidate was Jewish or not Jewish. So in that sense, there is not anti-Semitism. There was back in the 20s and 30s, but in the last half century, there really hasn't been. It's a mistake to say that if you have a Palestinian group and some supporters of it, that's anti-Semitic per se. There are divisions within the university based on support or non-support for Palestine, but to say this is rampant anti-Semitism on the campus, I think is an exaggeration.
Yeah, but it seems to be blended now with this wokeism.
Well, there is, to my mind, the charges of anti-Semitism or wokeism tend to often exaggerate what's really going on. There are, as I mentioned, there are some things that are truly worth complaining about, but you could also say that there's a danger to what's going to happen to free speech if the failure to say that a Palestinian group has the right to protest, not in the library, not in a public space, but in an area which others would be able to protest, and to say, no, they can't. The danger is that you're suppressing free speech. The university shouldn't take a view on the content of what the student group is saying. It can take definitely should take a view on the place and manner in which they're saying it. And you would hope that you would have independent student groups and independent faculty members who would say this view you're expressing is reprehensible or is unacceptable. And you can have also university codes, which is to say to call for the genocide of any group is out of bounds and cannot be accepted. There'd be some fines or punishment if you want for that. But if we get to the situation where you can't express your view that you think that the Palestinians should get more attention or have a case, then you're really suppressing free speech. And I think that finding that line is going to be crucial.
Let me shift to another phase of your remarkable life journey. And you spent a lot of time, earlier part of your career, looking in depth at nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferation. There's a wonderful picture of you and Harold Agnew, old friend Harold Agnew here. You're holding a kilogram of plutonium. I mean, I think I would be a little nervous.
Half a bomb.
Yeah, I'd be a little nervous about that. But let me just ask. And you say, I mean, you think that you were amazed at how humanity could invent this, but how problematic the very existence is. I mean, we've been relatively successful with a non-proliferation treaty. How do you view the risk of nuclear weapons getting out of hand going forward?
Well, I think it's something we have to continually concern ourselves with. Remembering that in historical perspective, John F. Kennedy thought there'd be 25 countries with nuclear weapons by the 1970s. What we have today is 9. That ain't good, but it's not as bad as we feared. And then when I went into the Carter administration as head of the Carter's non-proliferation policy, this was right after the Arab oil embargo, where people were of the belief that we were running out of oil, therefore we had to replace it with 600 nuclear plants, and there wasn't going to be enough uranium, and therefore we had to have much broader commerce in plutonium, which is a weapons usable fuel. And that, when you said at that stage, this is bound to create more proliferation, to give Carter credit, he did a lot to try to slow that down, and did. And so we've had proliferation, but the view that was prevalent in Kennedy's period or before Carter was proliferation is inevitable, so sit back and enjoy it. That is a big mistake, and that means that continuing to monitor situations like Iran and North Korea is essential. I mean, the danger is if we let up our pressures on non-proliferation, that you could cascade, and I think we'd have a much more volatile and dangerous world if that occurred.
Joe, one of the elements of our effort to prevent proliferation was something we call extended deterrence, and we've not really had a national debate about extended deterrence. I mean, in essence, extended deterrence means we say we will make ourselves vulnerable for the benefit of other countries so long as they don't develop a nuclear weapon. That's now being questioned in places like Korea. The Koreans see North Korea building nuclear weapons and say, how good is America's credibility? What do we say here? Is extended deterrence still a viable strategy going forward?
I think it's essential, and we had a CSIS study on how to make our extended deterrence in Korea more credible. The idea that Korea developing its own nuclear weapons would necessarily make them safer, I think, is not true. But the idea that the Americans can work with the Koreans to make our extended deterrence, our nuclear umbrella, so to speak, more credible is something we should pay attention to. So extended deterrence is one of the most powerful instruments of non-proliferation we have, but you're right that we have to continually work on its credibility.
Do you think that how do you view the way in which we've reacted with Russia's nuclear saber rattling here in Ukraine?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, somebody, I can't remember who, said that Putin's invasion of Ukraine proved that deterrence doesn't work. But in fact, what we find is deterrence is a much more complex game than it first appears. American positions in Europe didn't prevent Putin from invading. On the other hand, Putin didn't strike any targets in Poland or supply routes or whatever. And there's been a bargaining game back and forth between NATO and Russia on what kinds of weapons, how far they'll go. So Putin rattles the nuclear saber and trying to deter the Americans from giving more extended range weapons. And as we give more extended range weapons, then he realizes that he didn't deter us. And it's like, a game of teenagers who are playing chicken. Each one tries to get the other to swerve first. It's dangerous. On the other hand, what's important is, as far as we know, that Russians haven't followed up Putin's verbal behavior with any change in their posture or preparations. And that leads one to believe that maybe deterrence is working after all.
Yeah.
In both directions.
Yeah, I mean, when the one time Putin said, we're putting our missiles on alert, but it turns out he didn't do that.
Right.
And so clearly deterrence is having, but it's also probably had some effect in causing us to be more cautious about.
Oh, there's no question about it. And when President Biden said he wanted to support Ukraine, but short of World War III, that basically set boundaries, and then Putin was able to play his game of rattling his nuclear saber within those boundaries. On the other hand, if Biden hadn't set those boundaries, there would be the danger that things could get out of control.
Let me move into another part of the Carter administration, and you were actively involved in the Carter administration. You knew Cy Vance from time at Harvard, I believe, and but you also knew Zbig Brzezinski.
Right.
The two of them were kind of sparring through some of it. But you had a comment in here that I thought was really important about Jimmy Carter, and you say in your book, unfortunately, Carter's failure to articulate his larger strategy gave an impression of inconsistency. And I'd like to tell us more about it back then, and then I'd like to ask you about us today as a nation.
Well, Carter had strong principles. He had strong values, but he tended to focus on the trees rather than the forest. And so people often got the impression that he was wandering around in the forest and didn't know his way through. So in some ways, his policies were better than the overall impression. He did some very important things. For example, he gave back the Panama Canal before it became a terrorist issue in Latin America. He elevated the non-proliferation issue to a top priority. He had the Camp David meeting, which made significant steps toward peace in the Middle East. He raised the prominence of human rights as an agenda item for American foreign policy. So a lot of what Carter did, I think, will go down in history as impressive. But he never quite articulated how does these pieces fit together. And I think that meant that he didn't get the credit that was his due. It was partly that he wasn't able to sell the program to the public.
You, at the very beginning of the book, you talk about Eisenhower. It wasn't that you You were in Africa at the time. I think
Right.
you were going to be an African scholar then, but you were commenting on Eisenhower, and you write, Eisenhower came into office with modest objectives. He consolidated Truman's doctrine of containment and made it sustainable by a set of prudent judgments, such as avoiding land wars in Korea and Vietnam, that later trapped his successors. And then you go on to say that Eisenhower was able to separate his emotional needs from his analysis and avoided the trap that destroyed Lyndon Johnson. We seem to have gotten involved in a lot of wars over the last 20 years. Is this really, do you think it's the personality of the president that can't manage it, or do you think it's the nature of our society that's now demanding the politics is different? Eisenhower had the luxury of having been a war hero.
Well, I'd say Eisenhower's supreme commander in World War II meant that he had seen war close up. Mm-hmm. And he knew the importance of war, but he also knew the importance of avoiding it. And he was able to impress upon the public that he knew what he was doing. Remember, there were still very deep divisions in American society. This was a period of Joseph McCarthy and communists under the bed. It was the period when John Foster Dulles talked about liberating Eastern Europe. It was a period where we saw the Soviets go into Hungary, and after proclaiming a freedom agenda for Eastern Europe, we did nothing. So it wasn't that everything was perfect, but Eisenhower was able to give this feeling that he knew what he was doing. I think it's harder for a president who doesn't have that kind of experience to convey that same feeling.
Well, but it also, we had 20 years of just fruitless, frustrating war, where we, as a nation, clearly, we had at least political leaders that didn't have that sense of prudence, and we got into things. Do you think we now have that on, say, China? Do we feel that we've got the balance?
I think we made serious mistakes in terms of wars. I think going into Iraq was a serious mistake, and sometimes people say it was a product of the hubris of being the sole superpower. Mm-hmm. And I think that those charges are probably correct. Afghanistan's a bit different. You could say that we had to respond to Al-Qaeda's attacks on the U.S., but maybe we should have gone in, defeated Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and got out.
And made it a missionary
cause. Rather than try to transform Afghan society. Did we overdo it? Yes, it's clear. I think right now on your question about China, I worry a little bit about people in Washington overemphasizing the strengths and threat of China. Mm-hmm. China is a real challenge, there's no question about it, but it's a country with major problems as well as major strengths. And I think if we manage this situation properly, we can handle it and avoid a war, whether it's over Taiwan or the South China Sea or whatever. Mm-hmm. The danger, I think, is we get exaggerations about the threat that China poses, or we have to act now because later it's going to be worse or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so I think that a prudent approach to China, which you deter them, which we're able to do, is the right way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. When you write about the Clinton years, you headed up the National Intelligence Council at that stage, and that was back before we kind of changed it. I think it's lost a lot of its power compared to when you were leading it. But But you make a very important, interesting observation here, because when the Soviet Union collapsed and there was talk of a so-called unipolar world, and then you wrote this, which is really interesting. The absence of constraints made it difficult to formulate a strategy. With the demise of the Soviet Union, the U.S. lost the North Star that had oriented its foreign policy, for better or for worse. Does America always need an enemy in order to get its foreign policy together?
Well, I hate to say it, but it seems that we do better when we have something that provides a North Star. In principle, you could think that we would have the judgment and maturity to be able to devise a sensible policy without having to have a external threat. But in practice, it seems that the external threat has played a major role.
And are we making China too much of a threat in our imagination?
Well, I think that's the danger, that we overdo China. China is a real challenge. I don't want to underestimate it. But here's a country whose population has peaked. Its labor force peaked in 2015. Its total factor productivity has been going down, and its political control of entrepreneurs has been cracking down, which is cutting the source of new technology. China has a lot of problems, and if we see them as 10 feet tall, we're going to make a serious strategic mistake. As one friend of mine, an ambassador, put it, China is not 10 feet tall, they're 5'10", and we're 6'2". And that's I think, the better way to think about it.
Joe, as I said, you were the head of the NIC, and you write about, you say something which I happen to agree with completely. You say, every day I read a copy of the President's Daily Brief, prepared by the CIA's Directorate of Intelligence, and I was surprised to find out how much of it I have learned by reading The Economist, the Financial Times, and the Washington Post. So, what are your thoughts about open source intelligence?
Well, open source is crucial. I mean, there's more and more information which is available to everybody all the time because of the internet. And it doesn't mean that secret intelligence isn't important. It remains very important. But figuring out how it fits in the puzzle, you have to have open source. I draw the analogy to a jigsaw puzzle where you have this nifty little piece. You're not quite sure where it fits. But if you have the cover of the box which the puzzle came in, you say, I can see where that fits now. And open source provides you that picture of the cover.
But can I push just a little more on it? Because I remember when I was sitting in the emergency room and we were going through a tough issue, the only people who were in the room were those that had the credential of secret knowledge behind them. There was no way that open source was sitting at the table, other than through the president's own skepticism.
Right.
What do we do? How do we get a stronger voice inside the National Security Council deliberations?
Well, when you get to the stage, you're sitting in the Situation Room with just principals making a major decision, you can't have an open source officer. But if the director if the CIA director, the director of national intelligence is also sitting there, he or she can say, look, this is what we have on the secret side, but here are the various things we've gotten by careful culling of the internet. So a good preparation of intelligence should make sure that the open source is already incorporated in the intelligence which the officials will take to the Situation Room. But I don't think you can say let there be a director of open source. in the situation.
Yeah. One personal experience is when we bombed the baby milk factory in Libya.
Yeah.
And we thought we had credible intelligence information. Turned out it was not credible. And open source intelligence, the next day, open research told us it really was a baby milk factory.
Yeah.
But when you're sitting in that tight little group and only people with secret knowledge are sitting there, it's hard to get that perspective at a time when you need it.
No, it's a good point, and you have to build it into the intelligence which is presented to the leaders.
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for organizing our government. I want to get we're coming a little bit towards the end of our time with you, Joe, and I'd like to, you say at one point, you're comparing yourself to another guy, and he described he was a modest pessimist and you're a modest optimist. Okay, so where are you about America right now?
Well, it's a great question. I think I end the book by saying that I'm guardedly optimistic, but that I'm not sure whether the optimism is because of my analysis or because of my genes. But I hope it's the analysis, some of which is represented by the story that's in the book. But we do have some real problems, and I think the polarization that we talked about in American society, the way that's affected the political parties, the jockeying that we see now over, let's say, aid to Ukraine, in which a minority, one of the parties in the House of Representatives, is preventing the aid to Ukraine, which is supported by 3/4 of the American people. And there's something wrong with that picture. And it's doing us great damage internationally. Basically, others say, how can you rely on the Americans if a minority of one of the parties in one of the two houses is able to undercut what's been a major national priority supported by a majority of the people? So that's a problem. And that does worry me. There's also the question of what will happen to American institutions if President Trump comes back into office with what seems to be an agenda of revenge and changing institutions, undercutting the civil service and so forth. That could make a difference both in terms of how we experience democracy at home, but also in terms of our soft power abroad, how others see us attracted to us or not. So I worry, but I try to put this in a historical context and say that we've gone through periods in the past. Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s thought we were going to lose our democracy, and we didn't. In the 60s, it looked like things were falling apart, and yet we recovered. And by the time of Reagan's presidency, we were pretty much back on top. There's enormous resilience in our civil society and institutions, and the question is whether that resilience will be sufficient if you do have a return of President Trump with the agenda, which apparently is, as reported, is what he intends to do. So there are reasons to worry, but with the historical perspective, I think there are also reasons to think that we'll get through this as we've gotten through worse spells in the past.
Joe, you are rightly famous for being the author of the concept soft power. You talk in the book how amazed you were to have Chinese leaders lecture us about soft power at Davos. Is America still an inspirational power?
I think it is, but the danger is that we may lose some of that inspiration. If you look at, it is interesting that China realizes the importance of soft power. A very high-ranking Chinese official once asked me to a one-on-one dinner in Beijing, and he wanted to pump me about how does China increase its soft power. And I said to him, well, there are two things you have to do. One is de-escalate some of these conflicts you have with your neighbors. It's very hard to have soft power in New Delhi if you're killing Indian troops on the border. And the other thing you need to do is relax tight party control of civil society. If you have a genius like Ai Weiwei and you wind up putting him in jail or sending him to exile, you're hurting your soft power. I don't think he, I think the advice was correct. I think it was totally irrelevant to what he could do.
What he could do.
But it's interesting because as a result of that, when you look at Pew polls that have been taken of, something like 27 countries, the United States is more attractive than China in almost all of them. One area where we're tied is in Africa. I mean, different countries in Africa have different views, but by and large, the Americans are more attractive than the Chinese in Asia, North America, South America, Europe, and so forth. But if we don't get our act together at home, we could blow it.
Yeah, I mean, American society appears still to have inspirational aspects to it, but our government kind of is content to give lectures to everybody about how wonderful we are.
Well,
it doesn't seem to be working so well.
The government sometimes gets in the way of civil society. I'm always amused by the example of the marches in the streets around the world against the United States in the Vietnam period. And everybody was protesting government policy, but they weren't singing the Communist Internationale. They were singing Martin Luther King's We Shall Overcome. So an anthem from civil society was of American civil society was the broad voice of protest against the American government. I think that's a source of optimism, which is that our soft power doesn't rest just on government actions. It rests very much on our civic culture, civil society.
The government just needs to kind of let it blossom rather than...
Well, that's support it, but let the many flowers bloom.
Joe, we're coming near the rundown of the time. We've got a lot of people in the room here. They're a young generation. They're on the front end of the wave. They're trying to get on a surfboard and ride it in, and they're looking for just a little bit of guidance. What would you tell for these young generations? Is it still worthwhile trying to be in public life, and what do you tell them to do?
Well, absolutely. And when I was dean at the Kennedy School, I used to encourage students to go into government. And you may go in and out and in, but there's something particularly important about being able to serve your country. And, it may not pay as well. It may be enormously frustrating at times. But on the other hand, when you feel you can make a difference to the country as a whole, there's something enormously rewarding in that. So I say, keep your spirits up, keep trying, be prepared to deal with frustration. There'll be times when you may have to change your position to keep your personal integrity, which comes first. But by all means, do try to do something that affects the public good, and it's something that affects your community, but also your sense of where you fit in the community.
So this is not folks. You really should get the book. I mean, it really is fun to read, and it's just wonderful vignettes to a really important part of our history. This is not a valedictory. I know you've got more books coming, But I would like you just to, in our last minute or so here, so what is your kind of message to America at this stage looking forward?
Well, I think we need some reforms. We need reforms in the electoral process, money in politics. We need to find more devices where you restore the middle rather than having incentives to go to the extremes. So there are electoral reforms and process reforms that can improve situations. But I also think keeping a sense of integrity at the local level. I mean, the fact that so much of election supervision is done locally, and the real heroes of many of the difficult periods in 2020 were local Republican officials who just refused to be corrupted by the temptations of Washington power. And so I think those are the types of things that are sources of my optimism.
You know, Bob Dole once said, he said, our role is not to challenge American values, but to be worthy of them.
Yeah.
And I think that typifies your whole life, Joe. You've been a marvelous leader for all of us. It's a marvelous book. I want you to have a chance to read it. I've not done it justice to its quality, but I wanted to pull out the wonderful little pieces inside of it. So could I ask all of you, with your applause, to say thank you to Joe Nye for his whole life career and this wonderful book.
Thank you very much.